Hi everyone! So today we're going to be talking all about leaves and specifically the many things that can happen to leaves that can leave you going, oh my gosh, what the heck is going on? What is wrong with my plant? So I have grouped everything together today by the type of activity that the leaf does. So we're going to look at each activity and all the things that it could potentially be. And just so you guys know, this is going to be a pretty extensive list that we're going to be going through. I have time-stamped this video down below. If this is your first time watching this video, however, I do recommend you watch the entire thing because many times trying to figure out what a leaf is trying to tell you requires you to look at several different things that may be going on. So watching this whole video will help you kind of understand what I mean by that, but if you need to re-reference something specifically in the future, just remember that it is timestamped below so that you can quickly find that thing that you're looking for. But before we get into this list, there is one thing that I always want you to do first, no matter what it is that the leaves are doing, and that is to check for pests. Almost every single thing that we are going to cover on this list today can be caused by some sort of pest. So the most important thing to always do first, and honestly, you guys, this is true of anything that looks like it's going wrong with your plant, check for pests. Lots of times that can be what's causing the issue. So definitely best to rule that out before jumping to any other conclusions such as underwatering, overwatering, etc. But the first thing that leaves can do that I want to talk about today is curling. Now, leaves can both curl up on top of themselves as well as curl underneath themselves. But the main thing that you need to know is when leaves are curling, that is typically a sign that the plant is trying to retain moisture for some reason. And usually the reason is it's losing moisture from something. Now, once again, pests can cause moisture loss in leaves because they're sucking out the contents of the cells on the leaves. Now, if you have thoroughly inspected that plant and you know there are no pests on that plant, the next thing I would question is, have you potentially overwatered or underwatered the plant? If the plant is drooping and the leaves are curling under for most plants, and I'll explain what I mean in a second, that typically is going to be a sign that the plant has been underwatered. However, checking the moisture of the soil is going to be a very good indicator for you as well. If that soil is feeling bone dry and you're seeing that, then definitely that leaf curl is being caused by that plant having been underwatered. Now, as I just said a second ago, for most plants, the leaves will curl under and you'll see that drooping when a plant is thirsty. However, that does not hold true for all plants. This is one of the reasons that it's very confusing sometimes when you guys are trying to diagnose what's going on with your leaves. Not all plants react the same way. So for example, anybody out there who owns calatheas, marantas, pretty much any kind of plant in the prayer plant family will know that when those plants get thirsty, they curl their leaves as well, but they don't curl them under, they curl them upwards. It's just something that those plants do. So once again, if you know it's been a while since you watered that plant, you're seeing those leaves curling upwards, you know there's no pest anywhere on that plant, then that's a good indication that that plant has been underwatered. Now, as I mentioned, overwatering can also cause leaf curl. And this is one of the biggest problems that I know we face as plant parents out there is understanding leaf signs and symptoms and when it's underwatering versus overwatering, because lots of times the symptoms are the same. However, there are some key differences when we're talking about underwatering and what you see and when we talk about overwatering and what you see. Now, in the case of leaf curling, when it's related to overwatering, a good indicator as to the fact that it is from overwatering and not underwatering, first and foremost, is going to be how that soil feels. If that soil is still quite wet or moist, then it is a good indicator that this is not a plant that has been underwatered and is more likely being caused by overwatering. Future Drea here. I realized I never fully explained really leaf curl and when it happens related to overwatering. So basically, you guys, when you overwater a plant, the leaf curl isn't going to happen like the first time you overwater the plant. Leaf curl associated with overwatering typically is going to happen only if you keep overwatering that plant to the point where the plant starts to fail and starts to have root rot and starts to collapse on itself. At that point, you will see the leaves start to become curled. Typically, they will curl underneath themselves as they're collapsing from the overwatering and dying off. Now, another thing that can cause leaf curl, and this is a big one, is light. If a plant is getting too much light, the excessive light can cause the moisture from the leaves to evaporate more quickly. And once again, curling typically is a sign that your plant is trying to conserve moisture. So in order to do that, what most plants will do is they will start to curl their leaves up on top of themselves to try and block the surface of the leaf from the light. So if you are confident that there are no pests on your plant, you're confident that you have not been overwatering or underwatering plant, then the next thing I would look at is light. Now, another thing I want you guys to be aware of is that sometimes when leaves curl up on themselves, depending on what it is being caused by, they won't uncurl right away if you take them out of that condition. So for example, if it was getting too much light, if you move it into another place, the leaves might not flatten back out. They might never flatten back out, but you won't see more leaves starting to curl. So that will be your indicator in that situation. Now, sometimes hand in hand with too much light comes too much heat, because when sunlight is shining directly on a plant, it's also heating up that plant. And too much heat is something else that can cause leaf curl. However, if you have a plant that is not in direct light and you're seeing that leaf curl and you've ruled out everything else we've talked about so far, check and see if perhaps it is getting a draft from an air vent that is blowing heat coming onto it, because once again, that will dry out a plant and that will cause it to curl to try to protect itself from losing as much moisture. Now, if it is something caused by, for example, a heat draft or just heat in general from something, maybe you have a plant that's, kind of a few feet away from a fireplace and maybe it's off to the side and you thought it was far enough, but it's not. A good way to know if that's what's going on is to look at which leaves are being affected, because typically the only leaves that will be curling will be the ones facing the heat source, not the ones on the other side of the plant. Now, the next thing that can cause leaf curl that I want to talk about is a nutrient deficiency. But I want to make something very clear up front today about nutrient deficiencies, because they're going to come up a lot today. The odds of it being a nutrient deficiency that is causing what is going on with your plant is relatively slim, unless you are like somebody who has never fertilized the plant, you've owned it for 3 years. Then maybe it's a nutrient deficiency, especially if you haven't repotted that plant either in 3 years, because the nutrients in the soil are now depleted. So if that's the situation, then maybe for you, it could be a nutrient deficiency. But if you are fertilizing on a regular basis, the odds of it being a nutrient deficiency are really quite slim. So always try to rule out everything else first. But nutrient deficiencies can cause leaf curl. And if it is a nutrient deficiency that is causing your leaf curl, you are typically going to see it on the lower, older leaves on the plant first, because they're going to take what nutrients they're able to get and they're going to divert them to the top of the plant, to the new leaf growth, to support that growth. Now, another thing, if a plant is in bloom or about to be in bloom, it is also going to take all of the reserves it has and push them towards putting out those blooms. So in that situation, you might see old and new leaves starting to curl, because all that plant is going to care about is protecting that flower, because flowers are how plants reproduce. So obviously that's going to be priority number one for the plant in that situation. So if you do determine that it is for you a nutrient deficiency that is relatively easy to fix, just make sure you start fertilizing your plant on a more regular basis. Now, another thing that can cause leaf curl that I think often people don't think about is treating your plants for pests. Especially if it's a pest spray that you haven't tested on that plant before and you spray that whole plant down, and then a few hours later you notice the leaves are starting to curl, that's probably because the plant is having a reaction to something in that pest spray. There was something in that spray it didn't like. Now, another thing is, if you spray a plant down and then you immediately put it back where it normally lives and it's a pretty bright, sunny location, the sun can cause a negative reaction with something in that pest spray, which also can cause all kinds of problems with your plants, including leaf curl. So when you are spraying your plants for pests, just make sure that you give them some time to recover, for that spray to completely dry before you move them back into the regular location. And perhaps make sure that you're doing it at a time of day where it's not going to get a ton of bright light immediately after you were spraying it down. Now, the last thing I want to talk about that can cause leaf curl are viral infections in your plant. However, once again, viral infections are not that common. And usually if a plant has a virus, odds are it had it when you got it. Most people catch viral infections in plants immediately after buying them, because they start to notice that something's going wrong with the plant. The odds of a virus just happening in your house is pretty slim, you guys. It really is pretty slim. But honestly, viral infections, leaf curl is going to be accompanied by a whole slew of other things going on with your plant. So if you just have leaf curl and you don't have, like, the leaves aren't turning yellow, they aren't getting weird spots, they aren't, getting pits or scars in them or anything like that, you do not need to worry about it being a viral infection. But let's move on to our next thing that leaves can do, because this is a big one, and I know this is the one that everybody is going to be the most interested in, and that is discoloration on your leaves. And this section, we've got a lot of types of discoloration we are going to be going through today, but we are going to start with the one that everybody always struggles with, and that is yellowing of the leaves, because there are just so many things that can cause your leaves to yellow. But once again, lots of times there are going to be multiple signs of things we're talking about today going on. And you need to look at all of those signs and piece them together to sort out why your leaf is turning yellow. Now, just a quick reminder, you guys, that some leaf loss and yellowing of leaves is normal. Leaves age, they yellow, they die, they fall off. If it is only happening to the oldest leaves and it's not an excessive number of leaves at a given time, or if you've recently repotted that plant, because when you repot plants, when they're going through that acclimation phase post-repotting, you can see an uptick in yellowing leaves and leaves falling off. So in that situation, also don't panic and think it's something else. It's just a natural part of that repotting process. So if you're experiencing any of that, that is really not a sign for alarm. Now, where it is a sign for alarm is if it's happening at a very frequent rate. Now, once again, first thing you need to do is check for pests, because pests cause distress to leaves and cause leaves to eventually die off as well. And in the process, typically they will turn yellow. But if you're sure you don't have pests, your next thing you're probably going to jump to is, I've either underwatered the plant or I've overwatered the plant. And here's the big question of the day. How do you know which it is when you have a yellow leaf? Well, there's a few things that can help you kind of figure it out. First of all, check the soil. If the soil is feeling bone dry, odds are it's yellow because it's underwatered. Now, another thing, yellowing leaves due to underwatering typically will be preempted by drooping and curling of the leaves, because the plant is losing moisture, it's getting dehydrated, it's going to start to look a little sad before those leaves start to turn yellow. And then when those leaves do turn yellow, they typically are going to feel a bit dry because the plant has started to lose all of that moisture. And then eventually, when it gets to the point of falling off, it's probably going to start to feel a bit like paper, like really dry, thin paper. The other thing is, when a leaf is turning yellow because your plant has been underwatered, typically it is going to turn yellow and then start to pale. That yellow is going to become not super vibrant, if that makes sense. Oh, and before I forget, when your leaves turn yellow from underwatering, typically it is the oldest leaves that will be affected first. Now, if the yellowing is happening due to overwatering, there are some key differences that you're going to see. When it first starts to happen, not only are you going to see an uptick in the number of leaves that are turning yellow, but you are not going to see it preempted by any kind of drooping or leaf curl or anything like that, because the plant hasn't lost moisture. It's quite the opposite. It's got too much moisture. And so when those leaves start to yellow, they're also going to be a very, very bright yellow, and typically they are going to stay a fairly bright yellow. They're also going to feel much softer and, to a certain extent, wetter than if it is from underwatering, because like I said, with underwatering, they're going to start to feel dry because they're losing moisture. In this case, they have too much moisture and it's going to make them soft, and at some point they probably will start to feel even a little bit mushy. You also will likely see that yellowing accompanied by some kind of browning, usually around the edge or perhaps the leaf tip of the leaves that are being affected. Now, the other thing is that even though it typically still will affect the oldest leaves first, quite frequently when you have overwatered a plant, you will also start to see leaf loss at the top of the plant where the new growth has been coming in. And that leaf loss may not be where the leaves turn yellow and fall off like the older ones are doing. Sometimes you just have what looks like a perfectly okay leaf. They just start falling off for what seems like no reason. That is a very, very good indicator that you have overwatered that plant. And once again, if you check that soil and it's not bone dry and it feels damp and you're experiencing all those things that I just described, definitely you have likely overwatered that plant. Now, another thing that can cause yellowing leaves are cold drafts. Cold drafts, once again, can dry out the leaves and cause those leaves to yellow. If it is yellowing due to a cold draft, it's going to make that leaf start to feel dry once again, just like in the underwatering situation. However, if it is being caused by some sort of cold draft hitting your plant, typically it is only going to affect the part of the plant that is actually getting hit by the draft. So if you notice that the right side of your plant is getting yellow, dry leaves, you know you're watering it fine, you know you don't have a pest problem, and for some reason the other side of your plant looks super happy, green, and healthy, odds are you could have a cold draft situation going on in that plant. Just look and see if maybe you have an air vent that's blowing air on it. If you do, then relocate the plant further away from that air draft. Now, interestingly enough, you guys, you can actually also see yellowing of leaves on one side of a plant only if there's an issue with the lighting situation for the plant. So if you are experiencing what I just described, but you're like, my plant is definitely not in a draft of any kind, it could be that your plant is actually getting too little of light. And if your plant is getting too little of light, what will happen is the leaves that aren't facing the window, and typically still the oldest leaves on the plant, will start to yellow and die off because they aren't getting light. The plant's not getting enough light on the other side to help to feed those leaves on the backside. And so that is how you would know if it is a lighting situation. And in that situation, there are several things that you can do. You could actually relocate that plant to a brighter location. However, sometimes you can resolve that issue just by making sure that you're rotating the plant more frequently so that all areas of that plant are getting light. Now, once again, nutrient deficiencies can cause yellowing leaves as well, you guys. But typically it's going to happen in a very different way. Lots of times yellowing leaves due to nutrient deficiencies can affect the newer leaves more quickly than the older leaves. But one of the biggest things that I think you should look for in terms of yellow leaves, and if it's perhaps related to nutrient deficiencies, is the fact that typically it doesn't affect the whole leaf at the same time. So lots of times what you'll see is the mid vein and the edges of the leaf will remain green, and the in-between spaces will be what starts to yellow first. Versus typically when we see leaves yellow for other reasons, almost always it kind of either is like the whole leaf starts to go yellow at once, or it starts at the tip of the leaf and starts to spread up. But once again, if you are sure that you are fertilizing on a regular basis and you're not the type of person who's just gone 3 years without fertilizing a plant, the odds of it being a nutrient deficiency are relatively slim. Now, while we're on the topic of yellowing, you can also get yellowing on your leaves from viral, bacterial, and even sometimes fungal infections on your plants. However, in those situations, typically that's going to present as blotchy yellow patches that then slowly spread across the leaf and eventually kill the leaf off. Now, once again, the odds of it being viral are relatively slim. It is probably more likely in that situation to be either a bacterial or a fungal infection, in which case you would want to start to treat for that immediately and also remove any of the affected foliage. Now, the next type of leaf discoloration that I want to talk about is leaf paling, and sometimes this can be confused with leaf yellowing. However, leaf yellowing usually looks more vibrant in color, if that makes sense, whereas paling typically makes a leaf look like it's getting bleached out or just becoming much more faded in terms of its coloring. And number one cause for leaf paling and fading is usually too much light. And if you think about it, if you get other things in too much light, like your furniture can get bleached out or faded looking by being in too direct of sunlight for a long period of time, same basic concept. So if you see those leaves starting to get that kind of bleached looking color and they are in a very, very bright location and perhaps one where they're getting direct light, that is probably what is causing that. Now, in that situation, typically it's only going to affect the leaves that are facing the light source. So if the backside of the plant is still looking fine, then that would be a good indication that perhaps it is just too much light that is causing that paling of those leaves. Now, in this situation, it also can either affect the entire leaf, or sometimes you can only see it in terms of like little spots on the plant. And when you're seeing it as little spots on the plant, sometimes that's because it's now becoming closer to being leaf burn, which we're going to talk about here in a bit, versus just paling from a little bit of too much light, if that makes sense. Now, not to be very frustrating for everyone, but too little light can also cause paling of the leaves. I know, you guys, it's so difficult. I know being a plant parent is difficult, but I'm trying to help you out today. So how do you know if it's too much light or too little light? First of all, if that plant is getting direct light rays on it, odds are it's too much light. If that plant is not getting direct light rays on it, then there's a bigger possibility that it could be too little light. However, another real good key indicator in this situation is how bleached out the leaf looks. If a plant's leaves are getting bleached out due to too much light, lots of times it will go borderline all the way towards the color white, versus when it's too little light, what you typically see is the plants just look duller, if that makes sense. Like where this is a bright, lush looking green, it might start to look more like a mint green, a faded green of sorts. And that is a good indication that it's too little light, versus if I had this in too much light, it would start to get closer to like an off-white, almost also kind of papery looking color, versus if it was just a too little light situation. And also, you guys, if it is related to too little of light, it will definitely affect the entire leaf. You won't see spots or patches that are starting to look bleached. Another good indicator. Now, another thing that can cause paling of your leaves are nutrient deficiencies. And this is one situation where I might say it could be nutrient deficiency. It could be like that is actually, there are several things we're going to cover today where I'm like a nutrient deficiency actually could be what's causing that. But once again, It's only going to be that if you are just somebody who is completely irregular with your fertilization process, or if you're just using a fertilizer that is completely off base for your plants or the type of plant that it is. But if you are using a regular balanced fertilizer on a regular basis, and I'm talking at least once a month, but even if you're going once every 2 months, you guys, typically you're not going to see nutrient deficiency situations on your plant. But paling of leaves is one that can happen. But once again, you're usually going to see other signs in addition to that, such as, for example, stunted growth or deformed growth. And we are going to cover all the things that can cause stunted or deformed growth here in a little bit. And just a quick reminder before we move on to our next thing, that new leaves frequently on a lot of plants come in a paler, duller color. And then as they harden off, they turn into that final, very beautiful, brilliant color. So if your new leaves are coming in that way, don't worry about it unless they're never hardening off to that normal color that you expect them to be. So our next type of leaf discoloration is another big one for a lot of plant parents, and that is browning of the leaves. And the most common type of browning you are probably going to see is browning of the leaf tips. And I want you guys to realize that quite frequently, this is not an uncommon thing, and it does not mean that anything serious is going on with your plants. A lot of times it's just cosmetic. So for example, on calatheas, marantas, stromanthes, tenanthes, plants in the prayer plant family, we see this quite frequently. It doesn't necessarily look the prettiest, but it does not mean that there is something massively wrong with your plant. So what causes leaf browning, especially on the tips? Lots of times it can be the type or quality of water you're using, because plants have a difficult time. Some plants have a difficult time. Prayer plants have a difficult time expelling excess salt and minerals that are in water. And when they can't expel them, they tend to push them towards the edges and tips of the leaves. And then they sit there and they cause the edges and the tips of the leaves to turn brown and get crispy. Now, browning leaf tips can also be a sign of underwatering or overwatering. However, typically what will happen, we talked about the yellowing signs and symptoms of overwatering and underwatering. So if you see those happening, with a case of a leaf that is turning yellow because it has been underwatered, it will typically turn yellow before you start to see browning of the leaf tips. So if you see a leaf going through that process that we described before, it has all those symptoms that we talked about yellowing and underwatering, and then you see the leaf tips start to get brown, that is probably just an additional symptom that that leaf has been underwatered. Now, if a plant has been overwatered, you're typically going to start to see that browning on the tips more quickly than you will on a leaf that has been underwatered. As that leaf starts to turn yellow from being overwatered, that tip also very quickly tends to turn brown. But once again, you're going to have that kind of more mushy, soft effect going on in that leaf versus if it was a leaf on a plant that had been underwatered. Now, browning leaves can also be caused by too much heat. Man, can it be caused by too much heat. So once again, if you've got a direct draft going on your plant, and actually it's not even drafts, you guys, because the direct drafts, see, this is another thing where I'm saying multiple things can happen due to one thing that's going on. So a heat draft on your plant, lots of times it's going to dry out that leaf first. So the leaf is more likely to turn yellow than brown. But if, for example, you have a plant directly in front of a fireplace where it's not even blowing hot air, but it's just putting out heat, it will cook those leaves. And when I say it will cook those leaves, it will basically turn them brown and mushy, just like that. It's kind of like, think about like spinach. When a plant, you cook spinach and it like wilts down, but if you had it on like way too high of heat, it will start to look like darker and more towards the color brown pretty quickly. Same thing for your plants. So if you do see leaves that are going like completely brown and mushy, I would definitely check and see if that plant's getting too much heat. And once again, in those situations, it's typically only going to affect the leaves that are actually facing the heat source. Unless, for example, you were out of town and you're like AC broke and you live where I live and it gets, over 100 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer and the whole plant was just cooking in your house, then it might affect the whole plant, but you guys know what I mean. Now, lack of humidity is often cited as the number one thing that causes crispy brown leaf tips on plants. I've told you guys before, and I am going to say it again, in my experience, 9 times out of 10, it's not humidity that's causing that problem, unless maybe you are in a place where the entire year you are at 30% or below humidity. And if it is a very, very sensitive plant when it comes to humidity, but in my experience, even right now, I'm looking at my humidity gauge. It's like 31% humidity in here. It has been all week. And like my calatheas, for example, which is one of the plants that people say they get those brown tips and it's always because of humidity. They aren't having that problem right now. And so that's why I'm saying I honestly think people jump to the conclusion that brown crispy leaf tips is related to humidity way too quickly, when more often than not it's probably related to something else. But that does not mean that it cannot be humidity. If you are able to rule out every other potential thing, then that's all you're left with. But if it is humidity related, you guys, once again, the odds of it killing your plant are pretty slim, unless it is just a highly sensitive plant that needs 80 or 90% humidity to survive. Once again, in those situations, typically that browning, it's purely cosmetic. Now, too much light can cause browning of leaves, and it can happen on the tips, it can happen on the margins, but a lot of times you'll see it happen as dots in the middle of your plant. Now, brown spots on plants, which we will cover here in a bit, can be caused by any number of things. But if you are getting brown spots from too much light, basically that is leaf burn. That is the definition of leaf burn. Now, as I described earlier, sometimes you can get spots that are white if you're getting leaf burn from too much light, but you can't get them to where they go brown. And I feel like when they go brown right away, I don't know how to explain this. It's almost like if a plant was just getting sunlight and it was too much sunlight and it was like over a period of time, so it got those little white bleach spots from having too much light, versus if you took a magnifying glass and magnified the light through that magnifying glass into one spot on that plant, that would probably result in a brown spot that potentially then is going to get crispy and dry and flake off, and you're going to be left with a hole in that leaf. So if you are seeing that and you know that plant is in a place where it's getting a pretty decent amount of light and potentially some direct light, definitely I would move that to a less bright location or a place where it's not actually getting direct light. If it clears up and doesn't happen again after that, then that was your problem. If you still are getting brown spots on those leaves, like I said, we're going to cover the other causes of brown spots on leaves here in a second. But as I mentioned earlier, pest sprays can be a problem. When we spray our plants down for pests and we put them back into bright locations, it can cause problems. We talked about it with leaf curl earlier, but it can also cause plants to get brown spots on them as well. So if you just sprayed down that plant and you put it back in its spot and the next day you're like, oh my gosh, it's got brown spots all over it, odds are it's having a reaction from that light hitting the pest spray that's on there. Now, something that we have not talked about yet is over-fertilizing. Over-fertilizing your plants can cause browning on the leaf tips and the leaf edges. However, once again, just like nutrient deficiencies, the odds of it being over-fertilizing are pretty slim if you are fertilizing correctly and following instructions on the packaging for the fertilizer that you're using. The odds of you having fried your plant due to over-fertilizing are pretty slim. Now, if you are one of those people who is fertilizing with every watering, which some of the fertilization brands say to do that, and you're starting to see browning on your leaves that's not explained by anything else that I've described so far, or that I'm going to describe next when we talk about other brown spots on plant leaves, then maybe it could be over-fertilizing. If that is the case, one of the easiest things you can do is just back it off and not do every single watering. Don't fertilize with every single watering. Maybe back it off to fertilizing once a month for a while and see if that clears up the problem. If it does, then you know you were over-fertilizing. But most of the time, most of us aren't just dumping that much fertilizer onto our plants that we're causing the issue of over-fertilization and burning of the leaves via basically burning of the roots. But the next type of leaf discoloration I want to talk about are spots. All kinds of spots, all different colors of spots, because lots of times we see spots on our plants and we're like, what is going on? And there are a lot of things that it could be, you guys. So the first type of spots I want to talk about are brown spots. Now, we did already talk about brown spots as it relates to potentially leaf burn going on your plants. However, if you are sure that your plant is not getting those spots due to direct light hitting that leaf and burning it, the next thing I would check for, once again, would be pests. Certain pests some pests just look brown. So for example, scale will look like brown bumps or dots on your plants. Thrips are brown, adult thrips are brown, so they can look like brown spots on your plants. Certain fungal issues such as leaf spot. And leaf spot comes in many different colors, you guys, so it's going to come up a lot here over the next few things we talk about. But fungal infections such as leaf spot can present as brown patches or dots on your plant's leaves. So if you do determine it's pest, obviously treat for pest. If you determine it is fungal, you're going to want to treat those leaves with a fungicide. Make sure you keep that plant away from other plants because it can spread. That goes for bacterial infections as well, you guys. And in case of fungal infections, typically you can get rid of it pretty easily with a fungicide. If a particular leaf is really bad off, go ahead and remove it. If you want to remove every leaf that's infected to help clear it up more quickly, that's fine. Just try not to remove too many at once. Once again, we want to try never to cut back more than a third of a plant at any given time. And honestly, you guys, I was going to bring up black spots next, but there's not much different to say. Most of your black spots that you're going to see on your plant are being caused by the same thing. It could be pests that are actually dark colored that you're seeing that are making you think you have black spots on the actual leaf versus it's actually the pest on the leaf that you're seeing. And then also fungal or bacterial infections can present as black spots as well. Now, gray spots on a plant, once again, can be bacterial or fungal in nature. Also, sometimes thrip damage can present itself as kind of grayish, silverish, sometimes sort of whitish coloring on a plant. So once again, always check for those pests first. I can't drive it home hard enough for you guys today. Always check for pests first. But another common issue that can happen on plants that presents as gray spots is what's known as botrytis. And botrytis is a type of like mold. So once again, a fungal infection of sorts. And typically it happens, well, you guys, most fungal infections on your plants happen because of too much moisture on or around the leaves. So if you are having a problem with fungal infections, lots of times it's because it is just too humid. If you're misting your leaves, stop misting them. If you have your plant directly next to a humidifier, maybe move it further away from the humidifier or make sure you have good airflow. So once again, you guys, drafts, direct drafts like we've been talking about from a heat vent or a AC vent is different than airflow. When we talk about airflow, that means we want to be circulating the air around. So think your ceiling fan. Your ceiling fan isn't generating colder air. It's not generating hotter air. It's just circulating the air around. So if you are getting a lot of fungal issues, that's another thing you might want to look into is maybe just getting a simple little fan to put in the room to help circulate the air more. But if you do find that you have botrytis, once again, you just need to treat it with some kind of fungicide, remove affected leaves. If you want to, just make sure you're not cutting back too much of that plant. And real quick, you guys, bacterial and fungal infections can actually present on plants almost identically. So any of these things I'm talking about where I'm like, it could be fungal related, it also could be bacterial related. Now, the difference between the two is if it's fungal related, you can treat it with a fungicide. If it's bacterial related, you don't really have many options to treat it. In those situations, your best bet usually is to remove all the affected foliage, regardless of how much you're having to cut back, and then hope that the plant makes it. And once again, make sure you're keeping that plant away from other plants so that it doesn't spread. But the only way to very easily for you guys to know whether it's fungal or bacterial is to treat it with a fungicide. And if it gets better, then it was fungal. If it's not getting better, then it's bacterial. And once again, I just told you what to do in that situation, but that is going to be the easiest way for you guys to figure it out. So let's talk about white spots on leaves next. Now, we did previously talk about it potentially being burn marks from having too much light on a plant, but if you know that's not the culprit, first of all, check for those pests because mealybugs are going to look like white spots on your plants. Juvenile thrips are going to look like white spots on your plants. Whiteflies are going to look like white spots on your plant. And you know, if the spots are moving, it's a good sign it's pests, you guys. Good sign that it's pests. But if you know that it's not pests, there are multiple different things that can cause white spots. Once again, certain fungal or bacterial infections can present that way. Powdery mildew is one of the biggest ones that comes to mind. And honestly, powdery mildew can also look slightly grayish in appearance. So if it is a whitish grayish looking color, it could still be powdery mildew. That botrytis we talked about earlier, though, is typically a darker gray. Like it's definitely, you're not going to be like, is this gray or not gray? It's gray. But another thing that can cause white spots on your plant, especially in the early phases, is something known as edema. And edema happens when a plant's roots take up more water than the plant's leaves can expel through the natural transpiration process that leaves go through. And when that happens, basically that water builds up in the cells on the plant's leaves, and it creates these kind of like translucent, whitish colored bumps on the leaf, if you will. They're almost kind of like pimple-like looking. And then over time, those pimple-like looking things can actually rupture, and you can get what looks almost kind of close to powdery mildew, like it looks whitish, powderyish on your leaves when that happens. And then over time, that can actually turn into kind of a rust-colored looking situation on your plant's leaves. And if this does happen to your plants, you guys, one of the most important things for you to know is do not remove the leaves. Do not remove those leaves. Think about it. The problem was that the plant was taking up more water than it could naturally transpire. If you remove leaves, now it's got even less leaves to help transpire the water that it couldn't transpire in the first place. So in a case of edema, removing the leaves will actually make the problem way, way worse. So it may look unsightly, but it's not going to kill your plant. It's not going to kill off the leaves. It just doesn't look pretty. So do not cut off the leaves, but what you do need to do is readjust your watering, because if the plant was taking up more water than it could expel naturally through those roots, odds are you've been watering a little bit too frequently and you're bordering on an overwatering situation. Now, speaking of red or rust-colored spots on leaves, some of you might also refer to these as like copper-colored spots on leaves. Once again, a lot of the time if you're seeing this, it is going to be a fungal or a bacterial infection. Leaf spot presents itself in tons of different colors, and there's actually one that is referred to as leaf rust, which, as you can see, looks like rust-colored spots on the leaves. Now, if you are seeing rust-colored spots on your leaves, or honestly, you guys, brown-colored spots as well, I probably should have brought this up earlier, but if you are seeing the brown-colored spots or the rust-colored spots, check for the texture that the spots are exhibiting. If it is bacterial or fungal, it is typically going to be like raised, and it may not be raised on the surface of the leaf to the level that you can tell by your eye, but it won't look like there's a divot in the leaf or something's been dug out of the leaf, if that makes sense. So if you are seeing kind of a divot or a pit, or like something's been dug out of that leaf, once again, check the pest first, because that can happen related to pests. But if you're sure you don't have pests, then that is what we call either scabbing, once again, pitting, or scarring of a plant leaf. And there are several things that can cause that. But the good news is that most of them are not things that are going to be super harmful to your plants, because once again, pests are pretty much the number one harmful thing that is going to cause this problem on your plant leaves. However, sometimes leaves just get damaged. They just get damaged. You may accidentally touch a leaf when it's coming in and it causes some kind of damage on it. And so then when it unfurls, it has a little scar, a little pit, a little divot, a scab, whatever it may be. If leaves get stuck while they're unfurling, that can cause damage to the leaf, and then it can present as a scab, a scar, or a pit. And we are going to talk more about stuck leaves here in a bit. Don't worry. But it can also just be the end result of anything else we've talked about today, honestly, you guys. Edema can end result in a scab or a pit or a scar on your leaf. Any excessive light can result in a scab or a pit or a scar on your leaf. So if you don't have any of those other things going on and you suddenly are seeing scabbing or scarring and you know it's not because there are now active pests on your plant probably just got damaged a little bit somehow, and it's not really a big deal. It's nothing to worry about. It may not look pretty, but at least your plant's still alive, healthy, and happy. But let's talk next about holes in leaves. We do get holes in leaves sometimes. Once again, you can get a hole in a leaf from accidental damage like we were just talking about. That definitely is something that can happen. You can get holes in your leaves like we talked about earlier from too much light, creating a burn spot that then dries up, gets crispy, and kind of flakes off and leaves a hole in your leaf. But the biggest culprit of holes in leaves are pests. However, most of the pests that create holes in your leaves are not going to be found inside of your household. This is something that you're more likely to encounter if you are placing your plants outside, for example, during the spring and summer months. Caterpillars. Caterpillars can wreak havoc on plants, you guys. This is a leaf from one of my canna lilies out back. There is something called a canna leaf roller, which is a type of caterpillar that is from, I believe, a white moth of sorts, and they actually roll themselves in the leaf and seal it shut with some sticky substance that they create, and then they just live inside that leaf eating holes through the leaf. So caterpillars, huge culprit. Certain types of beetles will eat the crap out of your leaves. Grasshoppers are a big one around here, especially. Grasshoppers love to chow down on your plant's leaves. earwigs. Earwigs will chew holes in your leaves. So if you are taking your plants outside and you are seeing holes, I can pretty much guarantee you it's pest related, unless you had like a bad windstorm or something and it just like tore your leaves up or sent rocks or something flying through your leaves, and that's what created the holes. So in these situations, once again, just try to eradicate the pests, perhaps eradicate the pests and then bring the plant back inside, but make sure you've eradicated the pest first. And yes, the damage is going to be unsightly, so you can remove it if you want to, but as long as the plant's still able to photosynthesize, it's not like the holes in the plant are going to hurt the plant. But while we're on the topic of like not great looking plants when they have holes in them, let's talk next about deformed leaves and stunted leaves, because this is something that can happen a lot. And there's some different things that can cause it. And sometimes you may not be able to figure it out. It may just be something that is constantly happening. You guys know I've struggled with this on my watermelon peperomia, and I have tried everything that anybody has told me about what to try for this plant to get this to stop, and it doesn't stop. So I basically given up. I'm like, maybe if I give up and I quit stressing over it, maybe one day it'll just suddenly surprise me and start behaving. But there are sometimes things that are causing it that you can figure out. And once again, I hate to sound like a broken record, but check for pests first, because pests can definitely cause deformed leaves or stunted growth on your plants. Now, underwatering is a big thing that can cause stunted growth or deformed leaves on your plant, because the plant doesn't have enough moisture to be able to take up everything it needs from that soil in order to be able to generate new, big, beautiful growth. Now, once again, unfavorable environmental conditions in general can cause deformed leaves or stunted growth. So if you are getting direct drafts that are cold or hot on a plant, that can definitely lead to deformed leaves. It can definitely cause those new leaves to come in smaller. Now, we talked about lighting. Too much light, or honestly, you guys, too little light, both of those can cause stunted growth, sometimes deformed growth. Too much light is more likely to give you the deformed growth. Too little light is more likely to give you the stunted growth, because once again, too little light, not enough photosynthesis is able to happen for those plants to actually do all the chemical processes that are necessary to produce the bigger, beautiful leaves. Now, this is another one of those things where I do believe that nutrient deficiencies can be a problem if you are having particularly deformed leaves, but it can also cause stunted growth as well. So if you know that you haven't been fertilizing regularly at all, then maybe that is your problem. I would probably start there first, but if you are fertilizing on a regular basis, then the odds, again, of it being that are relatively slim. But one of the biggest culprits, in my personal opinion, if you are doing like pretty much everything else right, you know there aren't pests on the plant, you're like, it just started happening out of nowhere and there's nothing else going on with the plant, I don't understand. Odds are your plant needs to be repotted. So it's real easy to figure out if that's the case. Just slip that plant out of its pot. If it is severely root bound, that pretty much guarantees that that is what has been going on with that plant, and you need to get that plant repotted, and then it should correct itself naturally. However, you guys, I want to take a moment to point out that sometimes new growth that comes in smaller, not necessarily deformed, but new growth that comes in smaller, which typically is what we refer to as stunted growth, sometimes it's just natural. It really is. So for example, I've told you guys before on my Marantas, as they go from what I like to call little baby plants into teenagers, into adults, as that happens, the existing vines quite frequently will start to slowly put out smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller leaves. And then out of nowhere, you'll see whole new vines shoot up from the soil that produce way bigger leaves than you've ever had on the plant before. And then those old vines where the leaves have gotten smaller and smaller and smaller, eventually just kind of die off. And it's just a natural process that I see Marantas go through. So it's not necessarily something to be concerned about. Now, another thing, as we discussed in a recent video, all of my philodendrons practically now have started popping out new growth points off of like areas high up on the vines, not where I just pruned or anything like that. They're just, the auxiliary buds on the plant are just getting activated for whatever reason, and new vines are starting to form. And where those new vines are starting to form off the existing vines, the growth is tiny, you guys. It's tiny. It's much smaller than the new leaves that are being produced on the existing vines, but that's normal. That's natural. There's no reason to be concerned with that unless as those vines mature and get longer, you're seeing the leaves are getting smaller and smaller and smaller versus getting bigger. Then you might be, okay, maybe something else is going on there. But also a reminder, you guys, that a lot of vining plants, they're used to climbing things. So if you are somebody who lets your vining plants trail, it is not uncommon for the longer they get, for the leaves to start to get smaller versus if you have them on a pole, the opposite tends to happen. The older leaves are smaller and the taller it gets and the closer it gets towards the light, the bigger the leaves start to get. So sometimes it's nothing to worry about. But we've got only, I think, let me see, 3 more things to cover. I know this has been a long video, you guys, but I wanted to make it as comprehensive as possible for you. So the next thing is wet leaves. And I get questions about wet leaves so often, it is crazy. And I'm actually going to be pulling my phone up here, something up on my phone here for one of these, because I found a handy chart that I will link below in the description for you guys. I just thought this was a fascinating chart. If I have room to flash it up on screen here for you, I will as well. But one of the 2 main causes of wet leaves are transpiration and guttation. And these are both natural things that plants do. Transpiration, I mean, if your plant wasn't transpiring, then you might want to be concerned. But I wanted to cover with you guys what the 2 differences between these things are, because I think a lot of people are confused on that. And like I said, I found this handy dandy chart that kind of laid it out very well. So the number 1 thing that you need to know is that both of these processes are to eliminate excess moisture in the plant. So odds are, if you're having wet leaves a lot and they're really wet, especially if you're waking up in the morning to very, very wet leaves that are borderline mushy, odds are your watering is not quite on point. You're watering probably a little bit too soon after the last time that you've watered the plant, but sometimes other things can cause transpiration and guttation to go crazy as well. So let's talk about this. So transpiration occurs through what is known as the stomata on a leaf. And these are basically the pores that cover the entire broad surface of the leaf. And when water is released via transpiration, it is released in the form of water vapor. It's not actually like liquid water, I don't know how do I explain it? Okay, like this, like when you breathe out, there is moisture that comes out of your mouth. I'm talking right now, if we had like a microscope here, you would be able to see water droplets in the form of water vapor coming out of my mouth as I'm talking. That is what happens in transpiration. Guttation is actually liquid water coming out of your plants. So the best comparison I could give as a human is like when you cry. It is like a stream of water coming out of your eye. It is not water vapor. So that's the difference in the type of water that is coming out of the leaves. Now, another thing is that transpiration happens primarily throughout the course of the day, whereas guttation happens a lot overnight or first thing in the morning. That's why when you wake up, you're like, I went to bed, my alocasias, which are notorious for gutating, looked fine, and now they're dripping water all over the place and look a little bit mushy on their tips. And the other thing to know is that guttation is also, that water is also expelled through pores in the plants, but they're called, I'm going to try to pronounce this, you guys, hydathodes, I think is how you pronounce it. And hydathodes aren't all over the surface of the leaf like the stomata that we talked about a second ago. They are only on the leaf edges and at the tips, and they don't have a mechanism for opening or closing, versus stomata, which actually do have a mechanism for opening or closing. They can open to let excess water out, and they can close to help keep moisture in when needed. The other ones can't do that, so excess water is just going to run out no matter what, basically. So guttation is more likely to happen in humid conditions versus transpiration, which is more likely to happen in dry conditions. Now, once again, these are, like I said, they're normal processes, so don't totally panic if you're seeing this happen. Oh, and the other thing I learned from this lovely little chart is that I was right about temperature playing a role. So when it comes to transpiration, that takes place at higher temperatures. So think like when we get hot, we sweat, right? When your plant gets hot, your plant's sweating via transpiration, pretty much like we do. However, guttation happens at colder temperatures. And I think I had told you guys that I felt like my schismatoglottis was gutating more this time of the year. Well, not this time of the year now, but about a month ago when we had very warm temperatures during the day and then it was getting super cold at night. And then it was causing increased guttation over the nighttime. And I think it was because of that temperature shift. And so that made a lot of sense when I read this chart. Now, another thing to note is that when water is evaporated via transpiration, it is pure water. It is pure water. That is why even if your leaf's wet from transpiration, lots of times you don't see damage to the leaf from that, versus guttation, where we end up with like yellow or dry brown or sometimes dark brown spots where the leaf was wet. And the reason for that is that salts and amino acids and let's see what else to say, sugars are also being pulled out with that water when guttation happens. And as we talked earlier, when salts and things are pulled to the tips of leaves, lots of times it can cause discoloration on the ends of those leaves. But I thought that was really fascinating, you guys, so I hope that was helpful for you. Once again, I've linked it down below for you in the description if you want to go bookmark it for future reference. But another thing that can cause your leaves to be wet is if you do have too high of humidity, because then water droplets are just getting expelled onto the surface of your leaves and sitting there. So once again, if you think that that is the problem, either move that plant further away from the humidifier or set up some kind of fan so that you can get better airflow going on in that room. So the second to last thing I want to talk about today is sticky leaves. And some of you are probably thinking right now, yeah, we all know what makes leaves sticky. Why are you even talking about this? And I know you're thinking pest, which is true. If your leaves are sticky, the number one thing that is likely going on is you do have pests, because a lot of pests, mealybugs for example, excrete a sticky residue called honeydew, and that gets all over your leaves and makes them feel sticky. So 100%, the most likely culprit in this situation is pests if you have sticky leaves, unless you just recently, sprayed your plant with pest spray or something. That obviously could cause them to be sticky, or if you were spraying something else near your plants and it got on them, it could cause them to be sticky, obviously. But if nothing like that has been going on, it is likely pests. However, there is something else that happens specifically with Tenanthe plants. And honestly, I am not 100% certain if it happens with any other plants. I wasn't finding a ton of information regarding it on other plants, but I feel like if it can happen on Tenanthes, it can probably happen on some other plants. But I personally have never experienced it on any plants other than Tenanthes, and I have experienced it on every Tenanthe that I have owned, you guys. And naturally, my first thought was, oh my gosh, I must have pests. One of them, I did have pests, but actually it was pests and this thing I'm about to tell you about. But my other two Tenanthes, no pests. It was just straight up this phenomenon that happens. And I found a scientific paper on it because you know how I am. I'll link that down below for you as well. But basically, there is a thing that Tenanthes do when they have been kind of incorrectly watered. So when I say incorrectly watered, water stress, when they have water stress. So that could mean you've been underwatering them constantly. It could be you've been overwatering them constantly, or it could be you've kind of been going back and forth between the two. But for whatever reason, you're causing this plant to have water stress. And because of that, they actually start to excrete certain sugars out of the pores on their leaves. And when they excrete those sugars out, it makes the leaves sticky. Now, if you know for sure your plant doesn't have pests, and for example, it's a Tenanthe and it's sticky like that, that is probably what's going on. So definitely try and get your watering figured out with that plant. I didn't find anything that suggested that leaving that stickiness on the leaves is bad, but in my mind, I feel like, you could be inviting pests because there might be some kind of pest out there that's like, yummy sugar. So I would try to wash those leaves off if they are getting excessively sticky and you think it's from that situation. But the last thing I want to talk about, you guys, and so many of you brought this up when I asked you about your leaf issues, and that is stuck leaves. Stuck leaves. We've all dealt with stuck leaves, particularly on philodendrons, pothos, syngoniums. I recently saw this meme, which I thought was hilarious because, you can't unsee it after you look at it, right? That looks like a stuck philodendron leaf to me. And so we've all been there. We've all been there. I've been there. You guys have seen, I have shown you, I've been there. Anybody who owns a philodendron brandy, you have definitely been there. And everybody was asking me, please tell me why I'm getting stuck leaves. And everybody said the same thing. All I read online is that it's related to humidity. And honestly, you guys, everything I looked up, same thing. The number one thing that everybody says it is related to humidity. You know it's not humidity all the time. I know it's not humidity all the time because I have had plants in like 65% humidity and the leaves are still getting stuck. Now, another thing that just logically makes sense to me, you guys, because when we can't figure it out just Googling, sometimes we are too quick to Google. Sometimes we forget that we are smart. We are smart. We have experience with plants. We know things, you guys. We know things. So maybe sometimes we need to stop and just be like, okay, what might make this happen? So I did that. I decided what might make this happen. Well, a stuck leaf is kind of like a deformed or stunted leaf if you think about it. So any of the things we talked about that can cause deformed or stunted leaves could also logically be what's causing your stuck leaf. They could not be getting enough light. They could potentially be getting too much light. They could have a nutrient deficiency. And all you can do is troubleshoot it one thing at a time, unless you want a philodendron brandy. I'm sorry, you guys. I'm about done with that plant because I have done everything with that plant. I have moved it from a lower light situation to a brighter light situation to a higher humidity situation. I've upped my fertilization on it. I don't know how not to get stuck leaves on that plant. I really, truly do not. But for your other plants, once again, just troubleshoot it one thing at a time. My syngoniums have gotten better, and I didn't move them. The humidity's been about the same. I really honestly have been fertilizing about the same, and they just kind of got better on their own. So, you know, it might just be something that sometimes it's just, once again, it just happens sometimes on plants. And unless it's happening constantly, every single leaf, like on that philodendron brandy, then it might not be something to worry about. But if you are getting stuck leaves, once again, one of the best tips you guys have given me is to spray them down with a water bottle before you attempt to help release them. Be very gentle. If they feel like they aren't going to come, wait, try again in a few days, and just accept the fact that you're probably going to have a little bit of damage on that leaf when it does come out. And sometimes they will break completely off. The last leaf that came out on my philodendron Paraiso verde that you're seeing here, like it completely broke off. We've got a new one on its way now, but sometimes it just happens. And honestly, you guys, I also have this weird theory that sometimes if a plant's growing super fast, which normally we're like, yay, that plant is growing super fast, it's putting out so many new leaves. Sometimes I feel like leaves get stuck more often when that's happening. It's almost like it doesn't have time to fully process the new leaf that's coming in and let it unfurl before it goes to work on the next one. And then it's like it forgot that leaf before it and just left it behind, stuck there, while the new one came out over here. I don't know if that's an actual thing, you guys. It's just something I have observed. So I'm sorry that I couldn't give you like some more insight on stuck leaves today, but hopefully all of these other things that leaves do and what can cause them has been extremely helpful to you guys. If so, please be sure to click that like and or subscribe button down below so this video can spread to more people that can be helped with all of this information as well. Thank you so much for joining me today though, you guys, and I look forward to seeing you again next time. Aloha!